It's Friday, March 28th, 2025. Late morning in Mandalay, Myanmar, and, well, everyone is going about their day, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a busy city. Lots going on. Shops are open. People are out and about.
Then, bam, the ground just erupts. This massive magnitude 7.7 earthquake hits. And we're not talking a little shake here. This thing went on for almost a minute and a
Of
half.
85 seconds to be exact. An absolute eternity when you're experiencing that kind of violent shaking.
And the thing is, we've been deep diving into historical earthquakes quite a bit on this show, and you always think, oh, that was then, this is now. But this event, this is like a brutal reminder that these forces, these tectonic plates, they don't care about
You
calendar.
know, they're on their own time scale, moving and colliding over millions of years. And unfortunately for us, sometimes that leads to incredibly powerful and destructive earthquakes.
And this one, this is the most powerful earthquake to hit Myanmar directly since 1912. We're talking over a century.
And the early reports are just devastating. It's shaping up to be potentially the second deadliest in Myanmar's modern history, possibly surpassing even the upper estimates of the 1930 Bago earthquake in terms of fatalities.
We're seeing reports of over 3,640 deaths in Myanmar alone, based on the highest counts we have so far. And tragically, that number is likely to rise. Plus, there's the impact in neighboring Thailand, with at least 26 lives lost there.
And the injuries, over 4,610 people injured across both countries. Plus, hundreds are still missing, including those trapped in a collapsed construction site in Bangkok.
Yeah, that collapse in Bangkok, even being hundreds of kilometers from the epicenter, that just shows you how far-reaching the impact of a quake this size can be. It really highlights the whole issue of building codes and preparedness, even in places that might not be right on top of the most active fault lines.
Absolutely. You know, seismic waves travel through the earth, and they can be amplified in certain soil conditions, especially in urban environments. It's a wake-up call for sure.
Both Myanmar and Thailand have declared states of emergency, scrambling to deal with this catastrophe. And it just adds another layer of tragedy that the quake hit during Friday prayers, leading to hundreds of deaths as mosques collapsed.
That's right. The timing really amplified the impact on certain communities. A grim reminder of how factors beyond just the earthquake itself can play a role in the devastation.
And then you layer on top of all of that the ongoing civil war in Myanmar, which has made getting aid to those who desperately need it, and even just getting a clear picture of the full scale of the damage incredibly difficult.
Yes, the political situation in Myanmar adds a whole other layer of complexity to the response efforts. It's a heartbreaking situation.
Stepping back for a moment, in a global context, this earthquake is the deadliest we've seen worldwide since those horrific earthquakes that hit Turkey and Syria in 2023.
It is, and it really drives home the raw power of nature and just how vulnerable we are to these kinds of events. It's a stark reminder of the forces at play beneath our feet.
So let's dive into the why and the how of this earthquake. Why did it happen here and what made it so devastating? We're going to explore the tectonic setting, the specific characteristics of this quake, the widespread impacts across the region, and the immediate aftermath, the scramble to respond to this disaster.
Okay, so to understand why this happened in Myanmar, we need to visualize the geology. Imagine it like this. Myanmar sits right at the junction of not one, not two, but four major tectonic plates. You've got the Indian plate, the Eurasian plate, the Sunda plate, and the Burma microplate, all jostling for position.
Okay, 4 plates. That sounds like a recipe for some serious geological friction.
It definitely is. Think of it like a massive slow-motion collision going on for millions of years.
And we've got this zone called the Sunda megathrust, right? What's happening there?
Exactly. So picture the western coast of Myanmar. And imagine the Indian plate, this huge chunk of Earth's crust, is trying to dive to subduct under the Burma microplate. That zone where they meet, where they're grinding against each other, that's the Sunda megathrust.
Okay, so it's a convergent boundary, right? 2 plates pushing towards each other.
Exactly. And this megathrust isn't just some little feature. It stretches all the way south, curving towards the Cocoa Islands and even further, reaching into Bangladesh. And as it moves north, it eventually connects to the same colossal forces that created the Himalayas. That gives you a sense of the scale we're talking about.
Wow, it's mind-boggling to think about those forces shaping entire mountain ranges.
It really is. But let's shift our focus to another key player in this story, and that's the Sagaing Fault. It's a different beast altogether.
Right, the Sagaing Fault. It's come up in our past deep dives, and it seems like it plays a starring role in this earthquake.
Absolutely. The Sagaing Fault is what we call a transform fault. Instead of colliding head-on like at the Sunda megathrust, here we have two massive blocks of the Earth's crust sliding past each other horizontally. So picture two giant shells of rock grinding against each other.
Okay, I'm trying to visualize that. So
Yeah.
where does the Sagaing Fault run and how long are we talking?
Well, it slices right through the heart of Myanmar, running roughly north-south for a staggering 1,400 kilometers.
That's longer than the entire west coast of the U.S.
It is a massive fault line. On the eastern side, you have the Burma microplate moving northwards, and on the west, it's the Sunda plate. And they're not just creeping along, they're sliding past each other at a rate of about 18 to 49 millimeters per year.
That might not sound like much, but over geological time, that adds up to some serious movement.
You got it. And all that grinding and slipping make the Sagaing Fault the most active source of earthquakes in Myanmar. And here's the kicker. It runs right through or very close to some of Myanmar's major cities, including Yangon, the largest city, Naypyidaw, the capital, and of course Mandalay.
So when this earthquake hit near Mandalay, it wasn't a surprise in terms of the location.
Not at all. Sadly, the Sagaing Fault has a long and well-documented history of producing significant, damaging earthquakes.
What kind of historical events are we talking about?
Well, there were a pair of major earthquakes in May and December of 1930, then another in 1931, followed by one in 1946, another in 1956, one in 1991, and a more recent one in 2012.
So there's a pattern of these major earthquakes along the Sagaing Fault. Is there any way to predict when they might happen, or is it all just random chance?
Unfortunately, earthquake prediction is still one of the holy grails of seismology. It's a very complex science. But we can look at what are called recurrence intervals. For the southern segments of the Sagaing Fault, those involved in the 1930 earthquakes, studies suggest that major ruptures could occur roughly every 100 to 150 years.
So a century or so between major events. But that's just an average, right? This doesn't mean it's going to be exactly that amount of time every time.
Right, it's just an average. Earthquakes don't follow a strict timetable, but it gives us a general idea of the kind of timescales we're dealing with.
It's kind of eerie, isn't it? All that stress building up underground over decades, centuries, and then boom, it releases in a matter of seconds.
It is. And despite this long history of earthquakes in Myanmar, there's actually a surprising lack of detailed academic research on them, especially compared to other seismically active regions.
Really? Why is that?
Well, there are a lot of factors. Political instability has definitely played a role. It hasn't always been easy for international researchers to access the region and conduct detailed studies. Funding limitations and logistical challenges are also part of the equation.
So we have these big damaging earthquakes happening, but we don't necessarily have a complete understanding of how they work.
It's a bit of a paradox. We know they happen, we can see the effects, but we're still piecing together the detailed picture of how these faults behave.
Okay, so we've been focusing on the Sagaing Fault, but are there other potential sources of major earthquakes in Myanmar?
Yes, definitely. Don't forget about the Sunda megathrust we talked about earlier. Remember that massive 1762 earthquake, estimated at a magnitude 8.5 to 8.8. That likely occurred along a section of the Sunda megathrust off the coast of Rakhine State.
Okay, so that's another area to be concerned about.
It is. And then there's a third type of earthquake we need to consider, and these are called intraslab earthquakes.
Intraslab, what does that mean?
Well, you've got the Indian plate diving under the Burma microplate at the Sunda megathrust. Sometimes earthquakes can occur within that sinking slab itself, deep beneath central Myanmar. The 1975 Bagan earthquake, a magnitude 7.0 event at a depth of 120 kilometers, that's an example of an intraslab quake.
So it's not just about the plates bumping into each other, but also about what's happening within the sinking slab itself.
Precisely. It's a complex picture with multiple potential sources of seismic activity.
So back to the Sagaing Fault, it's obviously a big player in this whole story. How do scientists break it down or understand its different parts?
Well, based on various geological and seismological studies, the Sagaing Fault is typically divided into a northern and a southern section. The dividing line is somewhere between 16.5 and 23.5 degrees north latitude. It's not a perfectly sharp division, but it helps us understand the different behaviors of the fault.
Okay, so north and south, and we're focusing on the southern section here.
Right. The southern section is where the March 2025 earthquake occurred. And the southern section is further divided into 5 key segments. Starting from south to north, we have the Bago segment, the Pia segment, the Naypyidaw segment, the Maiktila segment, and finally, the Sagaing segment itself.
Okay, 5 segments. And some of these names sound familiar, like Naypyidaw, That's the capital city. What's going on there?
You're right. The Naypyidaw segment has two parallel faults running for about 70 kilometers, and parts of those faults run directly beneath Naypyidaw city itself.
That sounds like a recipe for trouble.
It definitely is a concern. But interestingly, the Naypyidaw segment has actually been relatively quiet in terms of recorded earthquakes, at least in recent times.
Quiet as in not many earthquakes.
Yes. The last significant earthquake there was way back in 1929, and it was below magnitude 7.0. So it's not like it's completely inactive, but it hasn't produced a major event in quite a while.
Okay, so that's one segment. What about the Meiktila segment? That one's geographically closer to Mandalay.
Right, the Meiktila segment is a long stretch, about 220 kilometers, between Naypyidaw and Mandalay. And it's quite linear, meaning the movement along this part of the fault is mostly horizontal, with less vertical uplift or subscans. Now, there haven't been any major recorded earthquakes directly linked to the entire Meiktila segment in recent history, but some researchers believe it might have been involved in the massive 1839 Ava earthquake.
The 1839 quake, that must have been a big one.
It was. But its exact rupture area is still debated among scientists.
Okay, so there's some uncertainty about what happened back then. What about the sagging segment itself, the northernmost of these southern segments?
Well, the sagging segment runs roughly parallel to the Irrawaddy River, and different parts of it have ruptured in relatively recent times. The northern part was the source of one of the main shocks in the 1946 sagging earthquakes, and the southern part caused the 1956 sagging earthquake.
So different parts of this segment have already released some of that built-up stress in recent decades.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean the entire segment is safe. There are still parts that haven't ruptured in a while. And this brings us to a really interesting concept called seismic gaps.
Right, seismic gaps. I remember reading about that in a study a few years back. Can you explain what those are?
Sure. In 2011, a significant study identified several areas along the sagging fault that hadn't experienced a major earthquake in a long time. These areas, called seismic gaps, were considered to have a higher potential for future ruptures because they haven't released that built-up stress in a while.
Okay, so they're like ticking time bombs, essentially.
In a sense, yes. And one of the most prominent seismic gaps identified in that study was located in central Myanmar, between 19.2 and 21.5 degrees north latitude.
And that corresponds to the Meiktila segment.
Precisely. And they estimated that if this entire 260-kilometer-long gap were to rupture, it could potentially produce an earthquake as large as magnitude 7.9.
So is it possible that this devastating March 2025 earthquake we're talking about, that it might have actually ruptured part of this identified seismic gap?
That's the million-dollar question, and the early analysis suggests that might be the case.
Really? So the pieces are starting to fit together.
They are. Seismologists have been looking at the USGS finite fault model, which maps out the rupture area of the earthquake. And their preliminary interpretation suggests that the rupture extended across both the Meiktila and the sagging segments, even overlapping with the estimated area of the 1839 earthquake. They also noted that the part of the fault that caused the magnitude 7.1 earthquake in 1956 appears to have moved again in this March 2025 event.
So this earthquake could have released some of that pent-up stress in a zone that was considered a high-risk area.
That's what it looks like.
Yep.
And the northern end of the 2025 rupture seems to have stopped just south of where the 2012 Shwebo earthquake occurred, which was on the central Swebo segment. It's like a complex jigsaw puzzle, where each earthquake adds another piece to the overall picture.
It makes you wonder if there are any warning signs, anything that might have hinted at this major earthquake coming.
Well, there was something interesting that happened in the weeks leading up to the main shock. There was a noticeable increase in seismic activity across various parts of Myanmar.
Really? So more smaller earthquakes?
Yes. In the first week of March alone, there were at least 8 earthquakes reported hitting different regions, including areas around Yangon, the Irrawaddy region, and Shan State.
So an uptick in activity, is that unusual for Myanmar?
Well, smaller earthquakes are pretty common in a seismically active region like Myanmar. But this uptick did raise some eyebrows. It's not always the case, but sometimes an unusual increase in smaller earthquakes can be a precursor to a larger event.
Like a warning rumble, perhaps.
Potentially. But again, it's not a foolproof predictor. It's just one more piece of the puzzle that scientists are trying to understand.
Okay, so let's zoom in on the earthquake itself. We know it hit on March 28th, 2025 at 12:50 p.m. local time, and the epicenter was near the Sagang-Mandalay border. What else can you tell us about its specific characteristics?
So the epicenter was pinpointed to Saganing Township, about 14 kilometers north-northwest of Sagaing City and about 16 kilometers west of Mandalay.
Okay, so pretty much right between those two cities. And we've been saying magnitude 7.7. Is that a definitive number?
Well, you know, different seismological agencies use slightly different methods to calculate earthquake magnitudes. The USGS reported a moment magnitude of 7.7, which is a widely accepted measure. But the Time Meteorological Department initially reported a higher magnitude of 8.2.
8.2, that's quite a difference.
It is, and the Institut Physique du Globe de Paris reported 7.9. So there's some variations, but they all point to a very powerful earthquake.
Regardless of the exact number, it's safe to say this was a big one.
Oh, absolutely. The largest earthquake with an epicenter in Myanmar since that 1912 Mamio earthquake, which was a magnitude 7.9.
So, over a century since Myanmar experienced something of this magnitude.
That's right. And the focal mechanism of this earthquake, which tells us about the direction of fault movement, indicates that it was a strike-slip earthquake.
Strike-slip, so the two sides of the fault were sliding horizontally past each other.
Exactly. Consistent with what we expect along the Sagaing Fault. And the earthquake occurred at a depth of about 10 kilometers.
10 kilometers? That's pretty shallow, isn't it?
It is, and shallow earthquakes tend to produce much more intense shaking at the surface because the energy doesn't have as far to travel.
That explains why the damage was so severe in the nearby areas.
Right. And the USGS finite fault model gives us an even more detailed picture of how the rupture unfolded underground. They estimate that the rupture zone was about 400 kilometers long and 20 kilometers wide, extending from Singu in the north all the way down to Pew in the south.
So a massive rupture zone. And did it rupture all at once, or did it propagate over time?
It seems to have propagated both northwards and southwards from the epicenter. Northwards for about 50 kilometers, stopping just south of Singu, and much further southwards, about 350 kilometers, reaching near Pew.
Two, the rupture ripped through a huge section of the Earth's crust. And were there particular areas along this rupture where the ground slipped more dramatically than others?
Yes, the model suggests that most of the slip, exceeding 1 meter of displacement, was concentrated between Singu and Naypyidaw. There was also another significant patch of slip under Pew. Interestingly, there seems to be a gap in significant slip between Naypyidaw and Pew, but the USGS scientists think that might be due to a lack of observational data in that area, not necessarily no slip at all.
Okay, so we might not have the complete picture yet, but what was the maximum amount of slip they recorded?
The maximum slip was a massive 6.3494 meters.
Wow, that's over 20 feet of movement.
It is a huge amount of displacement, and this occurred southeast of the hypocenter, between Sagaing and Amarapura.
So the ground literally shifted by over 20 feet in some places. It's hard to even imagine.
It's mind-boggling. And the whole rupture process took about 85 seconds. The greatest release of seismic energy, which caused the most intense shaking, happened about 30 seconds after the initial rupture began.
I remember reading something about this being a super shear earthquake. What does that mean?
Right, so a super shear earthquake is a fascinating phenomenon. Basically, the rupture along the fault propagates faster than the shear waves in the Earth's crust.
So the rupture is outrunning its own seismic waves.
Exactly. Think of it like a sonic boom, but for earthquakes. This can create even more intense shaking in the direction the rupture is traveling.
Wow, so even faster and more powerful shaking in some areas.
It's a powerful and somewhat rare phenomenon.
And what about aftershocks? Were there many after the main quake?
Oh, unfortunately, yes. Over 169 aftershocks were recorded. And the strongest one was a magnitude 6.7, just 12 minutes after the main shock.
Magnitude 6.7. That's a serious earthquake on its own.
Absolutely. And it was located right under Mandalay International Airport. The aftershocks were felt not only in Myanmar, but also across the border in Thailand's Mae Hong Son province.
So even after the main earthquake, the ground kept shaking, adding to the fear and uncertainty.
It's a terrifying experience, and each aftershock has the potential to cause further damage to already weakened structures and to trigger landslides and other hazards.
Let's shift our focus now to the impact within Myanmar. What were the estimated shaking levels across the country?
Well, the USGS estimated that the maximum modified Mercalli intensity, or MMI, reached level IX in the areas closest to the rupture.
MMI-IX, that's violent shaking, right?
Yes, we're talking about potential for complete destruction of buildings, bridges collapsing, the ground cracking open.
Yeah.
That level of shaking was likely experienced by about 2.68 million people in and around Mandalay, Sagaing, Bago, and Naypyidaw.
And how far out did that intense shaking extend?
While even further out, MMI 7th, very strong shaking, capable of causing moderate damage to well-built structures. That was felt in areas like Kayan, Shan, and Magway. And MMI-6, strong shaking where furniture can move and plaster walls can crack. That was reported in Yangon, Kachin, Mon, Kaya, and Irrawaddy.
So a huge swath of Myanmar felt at least strong shaking.
It's estimated that nearly 24.27 million people across 12 of Myanmar's 15 administrative divisions experienced MMI-6 or higher. That's a massive area.
And tragically, that translates into a huge number of potential casualties. The numbers coming out of Myanmar have been kind of all over the place, haven't they?
They have. Getting accurate casualty figures in the immediate aftermath of a disaster like this is always challenging, especially in a country with ongoing internal conflict like Myanmar.
So what's the most reliable information we have right now?
Well, we have to be cautious because the numbers are still changing as more information comes in. The Democratic Voice of Burma has reported over 3,640 deaths, with 700 missing and over 4,570 injured. Myanmar News, another outlet, reported over 3,340 deaths and nearly 3,300 injured.
Okay, so those are in the same ballpark. What about the official government figures?
The National Unity Government, the main opposition group, has reported a lower figure of over 2,400 deaths. And the ruling junta itself has reported more than 2,710 deaths, 441 missing, and over 4,520 injured.
So there's quite a range, even within the government figures.
It highlights the difficulty in getting a clear picture in a situation like this. The Myanmar Red Cross has estimated that around 50,000 families have been affected, and it's important to remember that these numbers are likely to change as more information comes in from remote areas.
Yeah, that's the thing. We're still in the very early stages of understanding the full extent of this tragedy.
Absolutely. The earthquake also caused major disruptions to communication infrastructure across the country. Phone lines and internet connections were down in many areas, making it even harder to get information in and out.
And that makes coordinating relief efforts even more challenging.
For sure, it adds another layer of complexity to an already dire situation.
And beyond the tragic loss of life, there's the immense physical damage to buildings and infrastructure across Myanmar.
Oh, the damage is widespread and catastrophic in many areas. The National Unity Government has reported that at least 13,411 residential buildings were badly damaged or destroyed, along with 280 religious buildings, including temples and monasteries.
And those religious buildings, they're often at the heart of communities. Their loss is felt deeply.
Absolutely. They're not just physical structures. They're places of gathering, of solace, of cultural significance. And tragically, many mosques were full of worshipers when the earthquake hit during Friday prayers.
That was just heartbreaking to hear about.
It was. The All Myanmar Islamic Religious Organization estimates that at least 250 people were killed in the collapse of over 50 mosques. And the Spring Revolution Myanmar Muslim Network, they've suggested the number of Muslim worshippers killed could be as high as 700 in Mandalay and Suding alone.
So the impact on the Muslim community was particularly devastating.
Sadly, yes. And the junta itself has reported damage to 670 Buddhist monasteries and 290 pagodas across the affected regions. These are vital community hubs as well, and the destruction will have a significant impact on the recovery efforts.
Let's focus on some of the specific areas that were hit the hardest. Mandalay, being so close to the epicenter, must have been devastated.
Mandalay was incredibly hard hit. Reports indicate over 1,790 deaths, at least 1,670 people injured, and over 1,000 still missing. It's estimated that half of all buildings in Mandalay City itself were severely damaged or destroyed.
Half the city, that's just unimaginable.
It's a massive scale of destruction. Even critical infrastructure like Mandalay International Airport sustained damage, with ceilings collapsing in parts of the terminal. There were reports of buildings at Mandalay University collapsing, fires breaking out, people trapped inside. It's a chaotic and terrifying scene.
It sounds like an absolute nightmare.
It is. And then you have the Daktwadi Bridge, a major bridge on the Yangon-Mandalay Expressway. It collapsed, and there were unconfirmed reports of vehicles plunging into the river. It's a vital transportation link, and its loss will have major implications for the relief efforts.
That's a huge setback. What about the impact on religious buildings in Mandalay?
Tragically, all 40 mosques in Mandalay were reported to have suffered damage, with at least 10 collapsing and over 400 deaths among those who were inside for prayers. Several monks were also killed or injured in the collapse of various monasteries.
So the impact on places of worship was significant, regardless of faith.
Yes, it was. And then there's this Sky Villa condominium, a 12-story residential building that experienced a progressive collapse, meaning it didn't just collapse all at once, but parts of it failed, leading to a cascade effect. It's a terrifying scenario, and there were multiple deaths and many people trapped inside.
It sounds like the damage in Mandalay was widespread, affecting all kinds of structures, not just the most vulnerable ones.
Exactly. Even a two-story tea shop and a three-story car accessories store collapsed, trapping people inside. And access to basic utilities like water and electricity was severely disrupted across the city.
So even for those who survived the initial earthquake, the situation is incredibly difficult.
It's a struggle for survival for many people. And moving south from Mandalay in Piabwe Township, the devastation is just as bad. Over 200 deaths reported, most buildings destroyed, including a 5-story Kambasa bank building where everyone inside, all 40 people, perished.
It's heartbreaking to think about the individual stories behind these numbers.
It is. And the historic Maha Ongi Banzan Monastery in Piabwe Township, a major cultural landmark, was also destroyed. There were even reports of a dam in the region being damaged, potentially leading to localized flooding and further disrupting the Mandalay-Yangon highway.
So the earthquake's impact is rippling outwards, affecting not just buildings, but also critical infrastructure like dams and transportation routes.
Exactly. And further south in Yamathan, over 200 deaths were reported, and many people were still missing, including children from a collapsed 100-year-old school.
So the impact on schools is also a major concern.
Sadly, yes. Schools are often particularly vulnerable to earthquakes, especially older buildings that might not have been built to withstand strong shaking.
And beyond Mandalay, what about other towns and regions? Were there other areas that were particularly hard hit?
Mektila, south of Mandalay, saw widespread structural collapse and at least 28 deaths and 166 injuries reported. The village of Bono tragically saw around 100 fatalities. Wunwin Township reported 51 deaths. There was a gold mine collapse in Singu Township, killing about 30 miners. Homes and pagodas were destroyed in Madaya Township. And Kaoksi Township reported at least 107 deaths, including the heartbreaking loss of 40 students and 9 teachers when a school collapsed during school hours.
So the devastation extends far beyond Mandalay.
Sadly, yes. And then there's Sagaing City itself, west of Mandalay. One rescue worker described the situation as catastrophic, with nearly 600 fatalities and 90% of structures destroyed.
90% destroyed. That's almost the entire city.
It's a level of destruction that's hard to fathom. A large section of the Ava Bridge, connecting Sagaing to Mandalay, collapsed, and tragically, the city's own fire station crumbled, severely hampering rescue efforts.
So the very people who are supposed to be responding to the disaster are themselves victims.
It's a cruel twist of fate. And 4 out of the 5 mosques in Sagaing collapsed, with fears of high casualties, especially the Min Street Mosque. Monastic schools and a nunnery also sustained significant damage, potentially leading to hundreds of deaths and trapping over 900 monks.
It seems like every type of structure was affected in Sagaing.
It was a truly devastating blow to the city. And the damage wasn't limited to modern structures. Even historic temples in Cheongju Township, near Sagaing, were affected. Further north in Mingan, a collapsing military bunker killed 20 people, and the iconic Hisan Moon Pagoda, a beautiful white temple, was largely destroyed.
So both modern and ancient landmarks were lost.
It's a loss for both the present and the past. And Tarayu Township, south of Sagaing, reported over 100 deaths. Even Shuibo, further north, recorded fatalities. The destruction is widespread and heartbreaking.
And what about Naypyidaw? You'd think the capital city, being relatively modern, might have fared better.
Unfortunately, no. Naypyidaw also suffered significant damage. In Zabathiri Township, there were 204 deaths reported, many of them civil servants who were in collapsed apartment complexes. Ground floor collapses were common in residential areas, and numerous ministry offices sustained severe damage.
Ministry offices. So the government's own buildings were damaged.
Yes, and there were reports of bodies recovered from the rubble of government buildings, including those responsible for rescue efforts, information dissemination, defense, and even foreign affairs.
So the government itself was directly impacted by the earthquake.
Absolutely. At least 80 deaths were confirmed within Naypyidaw city itself. And in a particularly tragic incident, the air traffic control tower at Naypyidaw International Airport collapsed, killing all 6 people who were on duty inside.
So air travel was also disrupted?
Yes. And the city's main hospital was overwhelmed with casualties, and even its emergency room roof partially collapsed. Roads buckled, ceilings collapsed in many buildings, and homes and religious shrines were damaged.
So it wasn't just government buildings, it was everything.
It was widespread damage, impacting all aspects of life in Naypyidaw. The military headquarters, parliament buildings, and official housing for government personnel also suffered heavy damage. with unconfirmed reports of government buildings completely collapsing and even senior officials among the casualties.
So the earthquake struck at the heart of the government's power.
It did. And even cultural institutions like the Defense Services Museum and the National Museum sustained damage. Collapsed buildings and monasteries were reported in Pinmana, a town near Napier, and there were unconfirmed reports of around 100 soldiers being killed in collapsed military buildings within Napier.
It seems like no one was spared from this disaster.
Sadly, that's true. And the impact extended far beyond the major cities. In Shan State, Nung Shui Township, which includes the popular In Lake, reported nearly 100 deaths.
In a lake, that's a major tourist destination.
It is. And many of the deaths occurred in the villages built on stilts over the lake. There was significant house damage reported, and the village of Kela was particularly devastated.
So even the more idyllic parts of Myanmar were affected.
Sadly, yes. And there were reports of deaths, not only from collapsing structures, but also from electrocution due to downed power lines. In Angbon, a 6-story hotel collapsed, resulting in multiple fatalities.